Some secrets are written in the ink of silent scars, worn as discreet tattoos that mark the bearer as someone who's seen too much. But some scars are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to notice them. Have you ever crossed paths with someone who seemed ordinary at first, only to have the world shift when you learned their true story? Imagine how much we miss by simply looking at faces without seeing the lives behind them. If this story of unspoken legends intrigues you, like and subscribe. Let's dive deeper into the unseen world of covert warriors and the mysteries they carry. Sierra Drake was barely 28 years old, but in those 28 years, she'd learned to move through the world like a shadow. She had mastered the art of blending in. Too good, in fact, at times. People hardly noticed her in a crowd, and it suited her just fine. Most days, she didn't mind that. A quiet life on the edge of the spotlight, enjoying the occasional sip of wine or glance at the art on a gallery wall. Those were the moments she allowed herself, after the chaos of the things she used to do. And though she long ago traded her military gear for civilian clothes, there were certain things about her that couldn't be discarded. The watchful eyes, the stillness of her movements, the way she stood just a little straighter than the average person, like she was prepared for anything to come her way. On this night, she was at an exclusive event in a ritzy hotel downtown, a charity gala for an organization she'd been invited to in passing. Her dress was simple yet elegant, a deep black that accentuated her lithe figure. She stood at the entrance of the VIP lounge, her lips curling slightly as the soft hum of the event pulsed through the walls. It was a spectacle of opulence, filled with people who thought they knew how the world worked. They were wrong, but then again, so many of them didn't even know how to truly look. Sierra wasn't one for the glitz, but she could appreciate the quiet power that came with being part of such an environment. She'd learned how to adapt, how to be in any room and remain unnoticed, something that had served her well when her life used to be far less civilian. As she approached the velvet rope, her eyes scanned the crowd, noting the faces of the guests and the bored-looking security guards. Most of them didn't know the first thing about real danger. She'd been to places where the air had been thick with tension, where a slight twitch in someone's hand or the sound of a far-off footstep could mean life or death. Here, in this gleaming VIP lounge, the only thing that mattered was who you knew and what you wore. A young concierge, fresh-faced and slightly overdressed for his job, stood at the entrance. His name tag read Damien, the kind of name that, like his clean-cut appearance, screamed of ambition and inexperience. Sierra didn't care much for the man. She simply needed access. She had an invitation, after all, a quiet one, slipped to her in the back rooms of a long-forgotten military event. This wasn't about business or personal gain. It was just a fleeting moment in a world of too many fleeting moments. "Excuse me, ma'am. This is a VIP area," Damien said, his tone crisp and almost rehearsed. The words held no warmth, as if he'd been saying them all evening. "I'm going to need to see your invitation." His eyes skimmed over her attire briefly, dismissing her instantly. To him, she was just another civilian. Another misplaced guest who hadn't quite figured out the rules of the game. Sierra raised an eyebrow, barely suppressing the sigh that threatened to escape her lips. "I was just headed in to grab a drink," she said, her voice smooth, easy, and perfectly polite. "I have an invitation, actually. It's a bit personal." She paused, allowing the words to land. It wasn't a lie. It was just an angle he wasn't ready for. The concierge didn't move. Instead, he looked her up and down once more, his expression growing colder by the second. He shook his head slightly. "I'm afraid I'm going to need to check that, man." Sierra didn't flinch. "Of course," she replied, her tone even. Her eyes locked onto his, allowing him to feel her presence just a little too strongly. She could almost see the gears in his brain turning. Was this just a woman who didn't belong, or was she someone who should have been allowed access, but for reasons beyond his comprehension? Damien stepped closer to the rope, pulling out his tablet and preparing to type. Sierra stood still, watching the way the light shifted across the room, how the shadows played along the walls. It was all too easy for people to forget the rules when they were so busy believing in their own importance. She understood it, but she didn't participate. A brief flicker of movement caught her attention, a quiet figure in a sleek suit. A member of the security team had walked by, glancing in her direction. It was a passing look, but Sierra felt something shift in the air. Was it paranoia? Perhaps. Or was it just the ever-present feeling that you were being watched by people who didn't know what they were looking at? Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back, Damien said, a note of impatience creeping into his voice. We need to maintain strict access control. This area is restricted. Sierra's gaze dropped momentarily to the entrance badge on his lapel. The insignia was clean and freshly polished, an exact copy of thousands of others, just another face in the sea of authority. There was no power here, not in the way he wielded it. But power, true power, was something he would never understand. Of course, she said, her voice still as controlled as ever. I'll step aside. But, Damien, she said, watching his eyes flicker as he looked up, I've been to places where restricted meant something much more serious than a velvet rope. Damien's jaw clenched slightly, but he refused to give ground. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you'll need to. He froze as he took in the faintest details. A sharp line of tattoo visible at the nape of her neck, just below the collar of her dress. It was hidden, but just barely. The sharp eyes of the young concierge shifted. Something flickered across his face. The world shifted. For a moment, there was more than just an invitation to show. There was a history hidden beneath the surface, a history that no one else in the room could see. And Damien, though still holding the rope, suddenly found himself unsure of everything he thought he knew. Sierra didn't wait for Damien to process the moment. She had learned long ago to leave people with their questions, to let their curiosity eat at them until they couldn't help but try to piece together the puzzle. She had been living this way for years, walking the fine line between what was visible and what was hidden, choosing when to reveal just enough to make others stop in their tracks. Her movements were deliberate as she took a step back, giving Damien space, but she didn't leave. There was no need to retreat. She stood there, calm and still, her gaze locked onto his as he tried to regain his composure. His fingers tightened around the tablet in his hand, betraying his uncertainty. His eyes flickered back to her neck, where the faint outline of a tattoo began to emerge as she shifted slightly, exposing just enough of the ink for him to notice. It was subtle. To anyone untrained in the language of military insignia, it would have seemed like nothing more than a faint, almost ornamental design. But to those who had walked the same roads, fought the same wars, it spoke volumes. It wasn't the tattoo itself that stopped Damien in his tracks. It was the meaning behind it. It wasn't just some decorative piece. It was a mark of the kind of service that didn't often see the light of day, a mark of the kind of covert operations that the world would never fully understand. The tattoo was of a black ox insignia, a symbol of a select group of soldiers whose very existence was cloaked in secrecy. Damien's eyes widened for a brief second, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what he had just seen. His training kicked in, a reminder that certain symbols were not to be ignored. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a story, a history written in ink that only a handful of people could ever claim to understand. He didn't know the specifics, but the symbol on her neck was unmistakable. The Black Ops tattoo. It was reserved for those who had been through the most dangerous, most classified missions, people who had worked in the shadows, keeping the world safe without asking for recognition. People who had seen things that would make most ordinary men tremble. Damien hesitated. His eyes flicked to the security guards at the entrance, who had been watching from a distance. They hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary, at least, not yet. He swallowed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had been ready to act out of protocol, to throw her out of the lounge and enforce the rules, but now, he wasn't so sure. Sierra, meanwhile, felt the shift in the air. She could sense the change in Damien's posture, the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the way his eyes darted to the tattoo, then back to her face, trying to make sense of what he had just discovered. She could almost see the moment he realized who she was, what she was. It wasn't about status or title. It was about something far deeper. "Do you need me to show you my invitation, Damien?" she asked, her voice low but laced with an edge of amusement. She didn't need to make a scene. She didn't need to flaunt her past to gain access to the lounge, but something in her sensed that he needed the confirmation. He needed to understand that she was not just a guest, but someone who had earned the right to be there, someone who had earned much more than that. Damien didn't respond immediately. His fingers twitched as if he wanted to pull out his phone, to search for some kind of validation, but he hesitated. He wasn't sure how to proceed. His role as concierge required him to uphold the rules, but he was facing someone who didn't fit any of the molds he had been taught to enforce. She wasn't a celebrity, not in the traditional sense. She wasn't a business magnate or an elite member of society. But the tattoo on her neck, he couldn't shake the sudden realization that this wasn't just a civilian. This was someone whose name might never make headlines, but whose actions had shaped the course of history in ways he could never fully comprehend. "Ma'am, Damien started, his voice faltering slightly. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." The words hung in the air, awkward and uncertain. He had no idea what to say. Sierra didn't need an apology. She simply nodded, her expression unchanged. She'd heard it all before. There were always those moments when people thought they knew exactly who she was, until they didn't. And even now, she wasn't in the mood to correct him. It wasn't her job to make him understand. She had bigger things to focus on. "I'm just here for a quiet drink," she said, her tone gentle but firm, shifting the conversation back to its original purpose. She wasn't going to make a scene. That wasn't her style. She didn't need the spotlight or the admiration that came with the recognition of her past. All she wanted was a moment of peace, away from the whispers and questions. But now, she knew that Damien would never look at her the same way again. The illusion of normalcy had been shattered. Damien stood frozen for a moment longer, still processing the realization that the woman in front of him was someone who operated in the highest echelons of danger, someone who had been a part of missions too classified for even the most elite military insiders to discuss. But the realization didn't come with a sense of awe. Instead, it left him with an overwhelming sense of guilt. His assumption, his dismissal, had been an insult not only to Sierra but to the very service she had given. And as she stood there, calm and unassuming, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his own ignorance. Finally, he nodded, stepping aside. "Please, ma'am," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with respect. "Please, go ahead." Sierra offered him a small, knowing smile, then walked past him. As she did, the sound of a door opening in the distance reached her ears, followed by the subtle hum of conversation that filled the lounge. But for the first time that night, she didn't feel out of place. She was exactly where she belonged, not because of her invitation or the title that had been thrust upon her, but because she had earned the right to move through the world on her own terms, no matter how many people failed to see her for what she truly was. Sierra made her way into the VIP lounge, the soft murmur of conversations and clinking glasses a familiar background to her thoughts. As she crossed the threshold, a few heads turned in her direction, some with fleeting curiosity, others with thinly veiled judgment. She noticed the subtle change in the air, people looking but not seeing. It was the same everywhere. Some would always assume the world was as it appeared on the surface, never questioning the story that lay beneath. But Sierra knew better than most that nothing was as it seemed. She chose a quiet corner, away from the bustle, and settled into a chair, the shadows of the room creating a space of calm around her. She didn't need to be in the spotlight. The years of being a part of operations that were too dangerous, too covert to be acknowledged, had given her a quiet kind of power. One that didn't demand attention, but commanded respect from those who knew how to look. Damien, still standing near the entrance, kept glancing over at her. His initial arrogance had given way to something far more complex, a mix of respect, awe, and perhaps even a tinge of regret. He watched her for a moment longer before he turned and walked toward the staff area. She could hear him mumbling something to one of his colleagues, but she didn't strain to catch the words. It didn't matter. The point had been made, and there was no need for further drama. The night wore on, and the chatter of the gala continued around her. But Sierra remained in her quiet space, untouched by the superficiality of the crowd. She wasn't here for the accolades or the recognition. She was here because, for once, she wanted to exist without being constantly defined by her past. It was a rare luxury, one that people like her rarely allowed themselves. But as the evening wore on, the sounds of the gala began to fade into a distant hum. A familiar weight settled on her chest, an unsettling reminder of the life she had left behind. The life that had once been filled with so much danger, fear, and purpose. And now it was a world she could only revisit in fragments. Her thoughts turned inward as she reached up, tracing the edge of her neck, where the tattoo still marked her skin, a faint reminder of everything she had been and everything she had survived. Damien's voice broke through her reverie. He approached cautiously, his steps slower than before, but with none of the previous hesitance. His eyes were clearer now, more understanding. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to intrude, but not willing to leave without saying something. "Ma'am, I just wanted to apologize again. I didn't realize. I should have known who you were. What you've done, I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry for how I treated you earlier." Sierra looked up at him, her expression softening. She could see the genuine regret in his eyes, the way his shoulders had relaxed as he spoke. She appreciated the apology, but she didn't need it. She had learned long ago that some people would never understand the full weight of her past, and she wasn't interested in educating them. "Thank you, Damien," she replied simply, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. "But what matters is that you understand now. It's not about what happened before. It's about how we see each other in the present." He nodded, his posture straightening as if the weight of her words had settled over him. "I will," he said, his voice quieter. "I'll do better." Sierra offered him a faint smile before turning her attention back to the room. The quiet hum of conversation, the distant clinking of glasses, it was all part of the facade. She didn't belong here in the same way they did, and she didn't expect them to understand that. But for a moment, in this small corner of the world, she had found a brief respite from the legacy that followed her everywhere. The story of who she was would always be something only a few could comprehend. Those who had lived through the fire and emerged from it with scars that were never meant to be shown. She didn't need validation. She didn't need anyone to recognize her accomplishments or sacrifices. She had survived, and that was enough. As the night wore on, Sierra leaned back in her chair, feeling the familiar weight of time and experience settle into her bones. She was at peace, in a way that few people ever truly understood. Here, in the heart of the world's most polished illusion, she could sit quietly, unnoticed by most, but still fully aware of the warrior she had been, and the warrior she was now. Her tattoo would always be there, a subtle, permanent reminder of a life lived in the shadows. But it was her choice when to let it define her and when to leave it unseen. Tonight, it stayed hidden, just as the world she had left behind remained locked away in a place only she could reach. And that, for now, was enough.